Good evening, welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Paul Grandal. I'm the Opalka Endowed Director of the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. And we really like being here at the Huxley. It's nice to be back. We like this space very much. We feel very welcome. And we're grateful to some wonderful partners here. So I'd like to thank our co-sponsors who helped make this event possible tonight. The New York State Education Department's Office of Cultural Education, the New York State Museum, and the UAlbany School of Criminal Justice's Justice and Multiculturalism in the 21st Century. Let's please give our co-sponsors a nice round of applause. I'd also invite you to pick up a printed program or visit our website, noswritersinstitute.org. We have 4 more events in this amazingly jam-packed spring lineup, including tomorrow afternoon, climate scientist, author Porter Fox, talking about his new book, Category 5, Superstorms and the Warming Oceans That Feed Them. It's kind of a light topic, but really important and pertinent. That's tomorrow, 4:30 p.m. in the Assembly Hall, the Uptown campus. I'm sure you can find it, and we have materials on our website if you need a map and things. And we also, to join us for that event and 3 others, like I said, on our schedule. And tonight, we've got our friend Jack Huber, who's the son of our colleague, our Writers Institute team member, Mike Huber. He's here selling books. This is a 40-year partnership with Bookhouse of Stuyvesant Plaza, and we're really grateful that they always come, they sell books, and the timing couldn't be better. Did anyone realize what today is? World Book Day. It's a thing. Yes, it's all over the world. It started in the UK. It's big in this country. It's a celebration, the joys of reading for people from all ages, from kids to us seniors. And so I would really suggest on World Book Day that we get a copy of Keeping the Faith. And if you stick around, our author, Brenda Wineapple, will be happy to sign a copy afterwards. And we will help support Bookhouse, because independent booksellers need our help now more than ever. So, yeah. So a few words about our moderator, who I'll be turning it over to, and he'll introduce Ms. Wineapple. Attorney Hank Greenberg is a friend and frequent collaborator with the Writers Institute, both as a legal historian and as a voracious reader. Mr. Greenberg is a shareholder at Greenberg, Traurig in Albany, and a former president of the New York State Bar Association. He's also a former counsel for the New York State Attorney General, and he also served as general counsel for the New York State Department of Health. He started his legal career as a law clerk to the late, great Judith S. Kay, judge of the New York Court of Appeals. Please welcome Hank Greenberg.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here and supporting the Writers Institute. You are in for a very special treat. The person who you're going to be hearing from and who I have the privilege of asking a few questions of has led one of the more extraordinary lives and letters amongst popular writers of fiction. She's an award-winning historian and literary critic, Brenda Wineapple. I'm going to spend just a few moments because most of all you want to hear from her. I could talk for minutes and minutes, if not hours, about her achievements, but she has won multiple awards and fellowships, including the Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Guggenheim Fellowship, 2 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowships, a 2009 Pushcart Award, regular contributor to the New York Times Book Review, New York Review of Books, and other prestigious and important publications. She has written, most of all and most wonderfully, numerous books, and the diversity of the subjects is absolutely stunning. And I said to her just before we came here today, I've never seen anyone who write nonfiction with such a diverse broad area of subjects. She has written multiple literary biographies. Keep that in mind. Gertrude and Leo Stein, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Emily Dickinson. She recently edited a collection of Walt Whitman's writings for the Library of America. Think of all those books over here. Would you imagine she's also written award-winning books on American politics and cultural history, including a history of 1848 to 1877, A Static Nation. It's one of the books you'll see at the end of the evening. If you want to read it, you should. She also wrote an award-winning book about, interestingly enough, the person who wrote about Gertrude and Leo Stein wrote a book about the impeachers, the trial of Andrew Johnson, and the dream of a just nation. And of course, we'll be talking about her most recent book in just a moment. But in addition to all of that, she has also found time to be an extraordinarily accomplished educator. She's currently teaching at Columbia, but she is no stranger to the Capital Region. She spent many years at Union College, ultimately rising to be the Doris Murray Stone Professor of Modern Literary and Historical Studies. And she's also been at the New School, CUNY, Sarah Lawrence College, and I said on and on and on, but most impressively and most importantly, for purposes of tonight, she is the author of Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce to all of you Brenda Wineapple.
Thank you so much. Is this on? Is this on? Yeah. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's going to be hard to live up to it. And thank you all for coming on Book Day or International Book Day, World Book Day. Well, same thing, World Book Day, Global Book Day. I'm so honored to be back in the Capital District here. And thank you, Hank, for consenting to do this. I am not a lawyer or a legal scholar, and so I'm a little awed by Mr. Greenberg here. But I'm so glad to be with you.
So I think I have read before your book everything that you could read about the Scopes monkey trial, including Eric Larson's book. And I will tell you, and not just to be kind tonight, I have never read anything so wonderful, so well written, so insightful about that trial. So perhaps a good place to begin, since this is the nearly 100th anniversary of the trial.
Just about July 2025.
So let's go back then to early May 1925, Robinson's Drugstore, Dayton, Tennessee, population about 2,000.
Right.
Tell us the story.
Here we are in Dayton, Tennessee, not Dayton, Ohio, Dayton, Tennessee, very small town. As Hank said, 2000, it was at the time famous for being the strawberry capital of the nation, actually. But in other ways, it had very little industry. And in that particular town, there were a group of people who had been made aware of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, had advertised in Tennessee papers that they would defend anyone who violated a recently passed law in the state legislature of Tennessee. It was familiarly known as the Butler Act. And what the Butler Act said was that you could not teach the theory of evolution in schools that were supported by the state because it denied the story of creation as taught in the Bible. That's pretty much it. And the ACLU, which was pretty new at the time, was only 5 years old, heard about this, and they thought this would be a great test case because we'd like to take this particular law right to the Supreme Court because it seems a violation of the First Amendment, the separation of church and state. So they put an advertisement in the Tennessee papers. Certain people in the town got wind of this, and they decided that they would ask a young biology teacher, actually it was a substitute teacher and the football coach, if he would be the person to step up. And he said, rightly it seems to me, that you can't teach biology without teaching the theory of evolution. So he said he would do it. Well, that's when all the trouble begins, really, in a sense. So here he is. He broke the law, because it is a law. The ACLU is going to defend him. The country gets wind of this, and by the time of the trial, because as you said, it was in May, the trial took place in July. By the time of the trial, at least 200 newspaper people, mostly men, had come to Dayton, Tennessee to cover the trial. When you think about that, in 1925, that itself is phenomenal, that they're all descending. It's a population of 2,000, so you can do the math, 200 out of 2,000, it's mostly, I don't know how they put them all up, really, and fed them all. They all came to town with newsreels and cameras, which are pretty new, for what was really termed at the time the trial of the century, and that was 20th century is a century of a lot of trials of the century, believe me. So this was 1925, and that's how this gets started. I think that's a little bit of background.
That's
yes?
fabulous. So,
So reassuring.
So, this whole trial is contrived, right? The village fathers want it to happen in Dayton.
Yeah.
The ACLU
Wants it to happen.
is soliciting.
Right.
And he's very guilty of the charge, right, of violating the Butler Act. Not guilty as a human being, but, right, there's no question, about guilt or innocence.
No question.
So a little bit about John Scopes.
Well, the interesting thing about John Scopes is that there's nothing interesting about him. I mean, that's and that's something, and that's a compliment. I mean that as a compliment, because when you think of 200 news people coming to town, and this being a celebrated trial, or intentionally a celebrated trial, as you're suggesting, all of a sudden he's going to get book deal offers, he's going to get movie deal offers. 1925, it's only 100 years ago. It's the same. It's the same America, and so he could have capitalized on all of this, and he really didn't. He didn't want the limelight. He sat in the courtroom, but he wasn't a major figure. He wasn't a star. We know the trial as the Scopes trial, because he's the defendant after all. But beyond that, he really disappeared. I mean, there were a group of scientists who got together money, and they sent John Scopes, who wanted to study and get a PhD at the University of Chicago. So he could continue his studies, but pretty much until I think the 1960s, nobody really knew who he was or cared or anything like that. So really it wasn't about him. The trial was about the Butler Act. The trial was about the First Amendment. The trial was about many things that were going on in America at the time, because if that hadn't been the case, it wouldn't be the trial of the century. It would be just another trial in a small town in Tennessee that people think is, Dayton, Ohio. I mean, so we wouldn't know about it at all in that case. But there were, to my mind, other issues that were extant, that were part of this trial, although they were, I suppose you could say, they were the subtext of the trial.
So one of the amazing things you do in this book, and I haven't seen it done so well, or anyone even try to do it, was explain how
crazy enough.
how is it possible in the 1920s, and all of us probably think roaring 20s, bootleg whiskey, speakeasies, literature is bursting out, right?
That's right.
Hemingway, Gatsby is written.
100 years ago, 1925.
Dreiser writes in American Tragedy.
1925.
Cities are.
New York was founded in 1925.
So New York America is rushing headlong into modernity.
Right.
How is it that a bill like the Butler Act even gets passed?
Well, as you know, in America, it's never one thing. There are many things going on at the same time. And while we're rushing headlong into the middle of the 20th century, we have to remember 1925, not everyone was reading The New Yorker. Not everyone was reading, The Great Gatsby. And in fact, there were numbers of people like Fitzgerald who had left the United States as expatriates, partly because America had seemed so ugly, commercial, vulgar, and materialistic. And at the same time, there were numbers, huge numbers, most people who couldn't leave, who were not able to, who could not make ends meet. So, to a certain extent, the Roaring Twenties, this is what I'm going to say is an exaggeration, but to a certain extent, the Roaring Twenties is media hype. It began to be hype, from my point of view, sort of in the 60s and 70s, when some of the people who were alive then were still alive, and they would be interviewed all the time about the 20s, and everybody's nostalgia about their youth. It was flaming youth and all that. But the reality on the ground was very different. The reality on the ground was a major, and the First World War had just been fought. It was barely over. It was over in 1918, so it's only a few years later. There are veterans out of work. There are people hungry. The Russian Revolution had happened around the same time as the war. So in the United States, there was something called the Red Scare. People are terrified of what were called Bolsheviks. And in fact, so many immigrants had been coming into the cities and into the country that in 1924, the year before the trial in Dayton, Congress passed I should put it this way, an immigration restriction bill that more or less shut the door on people who were called they weren't Nordics, they weren't Aryans, so you can see what's coming down the pike in that one. So it's a very complicated time where not everybody is comfortable. And as I said, to go back over to what's going on, I think it's encapsulated, which came as a shock to me when I realized that in 1925, the summer of 1925, just a few weeks after the Scopes trial, there was a huge march in Washington, got down Pennsylvania Avenue, somewhere between 20 and 50,000 Klansmen and women marched, which is phenomenal. There's a picture that I have in the book of that march. I mean, actually, H.L. Mencken, who was at the trial, lots of journalists covered that. So, naively perhaps, when I think of the, bless you, when I think of the Ku Klux Klan, you think of the 19th century, you think after the Civil War. But if you remember, in a sense, or know, 1915 was the showing of Birth of a Nation, and that kind of revived the Klan again. Now, why is the Klan being revived? I mean, that's an interesting question right there. Why was it so popular? People wanted to get rid of people that weren't like them. Why did they want that? Well, people were anxious. There was a lot that was going on, not just in the Roaring Twenties, but a sense of change, that all kinds of things. You mentioned the arts, for example. Forget Great Gatsby, but think of, Cubism and Picasso, and think of Einstein. Think of all the things that suddenly people aren't able to kind of get their heads around. And in times of great change, there's sometimes a tendency to want to go back to what seemed to be a safer, quieter time where, some fantasy of the country, where the country is going to be all white, all Protestant, all good, all rural, because what's going on in those cities. I mean, you think you're safe in Albany, forget it.
Well, that seems like a really good segue to the state of Tennessee's solicitation of the attorney who should prosecute this case.
Well, two things. There are two big names coming to town with the 200. Actually, the reason the 200 are coming to town, because I don't think people really cared about the Butler Act, They care about the celebrities. Celebrities sell papers, after all. And it was an organization called the World, I have to get this right, World Christian Fundamentals something, organization, group, something. Anyway, that particular group, the evangelical Protestants, who had a very specific way to read the Bible, which is to say they read it literally. It's not poetry, it's not just a spiritual text, you have to read the Bible literally. That means I, for example, am descended directly from Adam's rib, no joke, from the rib, right, in that sense. So you see where they're coming from. So they solicit on behalf of the state of Tennessee, they solicit a man named William Jennings Bryan. Now, we may have forgotten who William Jennings Bryan was, but he was a really big deal in 1925. He had been a big deal for a long time. He was basically a leader of the Democratic Party for really 30 years. And what's interesting, among things that are interesting about Bryan, is that he got the Democratic nomination for president 3 times. I mean, he lost 3 times. I mean, he wouldn't keep getting it if he hadn't lost, but it's kind of tells you something about the Democratic Party. They keep putting him up because he was so popular. He was enormously popular. And the interesting thing, too, about Bryan was he was popular because he was a progressive. He was a progressive, but he had a complicated view of what the country should and could be like. So he was a progressive who backed prohibition, but he was a progressive who backed women's suffrage. He had also served in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet during Wilson's whatever term it was. I guess it was his first term. And he resigned in protest because he thought Wilson wasn't keeping to his campaign pledge of staying out of the war, that Wilson was actually favoring England over Germany. So he resigned. So he was a man of principle, but he was also principally a fundamentalist Christian who believed that the Bible should be read literally, but more important even, I think, than that, was that he believed that that's how we should all read the Bible. I mean, if you want to read the Bible literally, that's fine. But he believed that we all have to read the Bible that way. And that becomes problematic. But not for the organization, because they wanted the World Christians Fundamentalist Organization. They wanted Bryan there because he was going to bring enormous, he was going to shine the limelight on not just Dayton, but on this issue of how the Bible should be read and who should be in charge of the way we read and think and so forth and so on. When a man named Clarence Darrow, who was equally famous at the time, or infamous, a celebrated criminal attorney who had for many years been a labor attorney, known as a radical in many instances, from Chicago, when he heard that Bryan accepted to be the lead of the prosecution, Darrow volunteered to go to Dayton and defend Scopes pro bono. He just wanted to go, basically. So these 2 guys are coming to town, and of course the ACLU is backing what would be the defense team. So this already, you can sort of see how this is sort of playing out as almost theater, really.
So why did Darrow want to do this?
Why did Darrow want to do this? Well, he didn't like Bryan much. I mean, he used to like Bryan back in the 1890s, but that was a long time ago. And Bryan had, a lot of his positions had kind of calcified in a ways that Darrow's hadn't. But more to the point, Darrow really thought 2 things. One was on the Bryan side, he thought Bryan was a fanatic, basically. But beyond that, he really was, he was really made, I'm trying to think of the right word, upset, disturbed, terrified by fanaticism itself. And so Bryan, it wasn't just Bryan, it was what Bryan represented. And what Bryan represented was a complete denial of American values which are enshrined, according to Darrow, in the Constitution and the First Amendment. And so he felt by passing this Butler law, this Butler Act, it's a kind of slippery slope. You outlaw evolution in the classroom today, what are you going to outlaw and who are you going to outlaw tomorrow and who's going to make these decisions? And so he felt that there are primary principles at stake. And so he wanted to be there, and that's why he said pro bono. He wanted to be there, and he really wanted to fight for what he felt were American values that were being seriously undermined by the state legislature and by people like Bryan, who had the ear of the public. As I said, he was still a very powerful leader in the Democratic Party. And, you know, who knows what would have happened. He might have had aspirations for a fourth term as nominee.
So what strikes me is
Yeah.
just about Darrow different from Bryan, in addition to the enormous differences
Yeah.
of their thoughts, was whereas Bryan's an enormously popular political
Yeah.
figure,
Yeah.
and Darrow comes to us today as an iconic figure in the law, the attorney for the damned,
Right.
a person, particularly in light of everything we see in the world right now, who would speak truth to power, represent
Yeah.
the most notorious criminals and murderers, a celebrated
Right.
agnostic.
Right.
He was not the most popular figure in America at the time, although he had his followers. Right?
Yeah, yeah. No, he was well known. Yeah, I mean, he was popular in the sense that everybody knew who he was. He was not necessarily liked. It's a different kind of thing. But yeah, he was very, very well known. But you're right about that. He's a controversial figure. I mean, so is Bryan, but we're talking about Darrow now. He was definitely a controversial figure, you know.
Any supporting cast of characters that are worth talking about a little bit?
Yeah, I love the supporting cast of characters. You know, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, that's why I like nonfiction, basically. Because Darrow is going to, I mean, how could he not be the kind of lead attorney, even if nobody wants him there? But they did. I mean, and the ACLU, which they all met, and Scopes, by the way, remember Scopes? I mean, he was part of the trial. Scopes went to New York to meet with the ACLU, and I don't remember now if Darrow was there, but there were some of the ACLU lawyers that were there that were, they were talking about who should represent Scopes, and Scopes was very adamant. He wanted Darrow, and since he is the defendant, right? I mean, he gets to choose who he wants, and he definitely wanted Darrow there. The ACLU sent two other major people at the time who were one was very well known at the time, and one became known, but in certain legal circles, you probably had heard of him, right? One was named Dudley Field Malone, and he was, what's interesting about Malone and the other guy who was on the defense team, Arthur Garfield Hayes, who, by the way, you have to, like I said, you can't make this up. Arthur Garfield Hayes was named for 3 American presidents, right? I mean, you know, if I was writing fiction, people would think I was nuts. So Arthur Garfield Hayes was a very important civil liberties lawyer for the rest of his life. He actually tried to defend the guys at the Reichstag trial in the 30s in Germany. He was a very unusual man. He's secular Jew, and he was on the defense team. And then, as I said, Dudley Field Malone, who was from New York, Irish Catholic, who had also been working in Woodrow Wilson's administration, but he too resigned in protest because a group of women were picketing the White House in 1917, and they were picketing because Wilson had promised to get the Voting Act, you know, so women could have the vote women couldn't vote, passed, and Wilson was kind of backsliding. He really wasn't that interested, and he had other interests. But the women were picketing, and Wilson had them arrested and sent to jail. So Malone was furious, and he quit he had a big job in the administration, he quit. So he was part of the trial lawyers himself, and so since he worked in the Wilson administration, he knew Bryan. So those three, Darrow, Hayes, and Malone were the three mainstays of the defense team. It was fascinating, really very interesting, and they played different roles in the trial.
That would be a dream team.
That was a dream team. Yeah.
So we've set the stage, the sweltering heat now of July,
This is funny.
Dayton, Tennessee, hot dog stands,
Lemonade.
a monkey shows up every day at the trial, not in the courtroom.
Not in the courtroom.
I'll just take sort of the liberty of the prosecution's case is pretty easy,
Yeah.
right? He taught evolution. The statute prohibits evolution.
Can I say one thing?
Please.
You know,
Penny.
Look, Mr. Lawyer, may I say one thing? What's interesting to me about that is that John Scopes taught from the state-authorized textbook. They didn't bring this up at the trial. It was a state-authorized textbook, and it had evolution in the textbook.
Right.
You know, if I were defending him, I would say, well, he just taught, I mean, he could, right?
Oh, I'm completely sympathetic
But I'm not a lawyer.
to John Scopes. Make no mistake about that. But his lawyers wanted him to be guilty because they wanted
Yes,
a test case.
Yes,
he
he's
could
right.
take to the U.S. Supreme Court and have the
Exactly.
statute
That was the
struck
whole
down.
point. That's why the ACLU was involved. Absolutely. Good.
Now, it seems to me as though Clarence Darrow had some different ideas about how this trial should
Yeah.
be used.
Yeah. Darrow, you know, I think it's too strong what I'm going to say, but I think people either loved Darrow or hated Darrow. You know, and that's too strong, obviously, but you get the drift in a certain sense. And so those who were a little hesitant around Darrow, let's say they didn't dislike him, but they're a little nervous around him, it's because they would think of him as a showboat, a headline hunter, right, in that sense. And Darrow was brilliant, and one of the things that he was brilliant about was using the media. And the media at the time, I mean, the media at the time were newspapers and radio. I mean, this trial, by the way, is the first trial that was ever broadcast on the radio, Chicago radio station, just as an aside. But anyway, so the newspapers were huge at the time, and Darrow really was trying the case, not just to get it before the Supreme Court, but in a court of public opinion. Initially, the ACLU was thinking of this as a strictly constitutional case. So Darrow's point of view is slightly different because, as I said before, he feels that the issues, yeah, they're definitely First Amendment issues, but they go way beyond that because they seem to speak to, as I said earlier, certain aspects of American culture that he finds terrifying in that way. And he's a maverick, you know, as you mentioned, some of the little detail I like about Darrow because, yeah, he defended like really awful people like Leopold and Loeb, not because he thought they were guilty, I mean, innocent. They were not innocent. They said they were happy with what they did, but he didn't want them to have the death penalty. So he was taking on these like really awful cases. People would say, well, how can you even do that, really, in a sense? And actually, later on, this is so amazing to me about Darrow, among many things. You know, FDR put him on some, I think FDR put him on some kind of investigative committee. There was some backlash about one of his new programs, the National Recovery Act. And he figured, you know, Darrow's old, he's good to have in that place, he won't do anything. And Darrow slashed the program. I mean, so you can't trust Darrow, because he's going to do what he thinks is right. And so he was going to prosecute the case in a way that the ACLU, in sort of strict, kind of by-the-book lawyers, would never have thought of. And, you know, he well, as you know, and maybe some of you know, he sort of had a legal kind of card up his sleeve that I don't think people generally do they?
Well,
He's the expert.
Darrow is the greatest trial lawyer of the 20th century.
Give
Shrewdest.
him the 21st too, but you know.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. The cleverest.
Yeah.
Most
eloquent.
cunning, and extraordinarily eloquent.
Yeah, really.
But back to the trial, the prosecution rests, cut and dried.
No. First of all, wait. First of all, it's July. It's Tennessee. What do you think the weather's like? Right? And there's no air conditioning. In fact, the jury had to beg for a fan. No, I kid you not, really. In that, there's just so many things that went on at this trial. Then, because there were so many, not just spectators and news people, but there was camera equipment, and the camera equipment in 1925 is heavy. You know, I remember like old cameras, and they're heavy, and they go like this, and so the court, the court house, the trial is taking place on the second floor of the courtroom, and below, people can see plaster coming down. So it looks like the floor is going to give way. So the judge, who's himself a piece of work, the judge says, we got to go outside to continue. So really, I know, unbelievable. So they have bleachers set out outside in a kind of platformy thing. And they all, the cameras and the newsmen and the spectators, and I guess the jury was never allowed to hear much of anything, but that's a different story. So they all kind of go marching outside. When they go marching outside, who's going to be taking the stand on this kind of platform with these chairs? I guess they're wooden chairs. Darrow has called William Jennings Bryan to the stand. You don't do that.
It's illegal for any one of 100 reasons.
But he had an argument.
But
would you buy the argument?
this is probably the most stunning thing that's ever happened in a trial, maybe in American history. The defense calling the prosecutor.
It happened more often.
What was the reason? How did it happen?
Well, the reason is that Bryan set himself up as an expert on the Bible. So Darrow basically said, well, you're an expert on the Bible. I'm calling you as an expert on the Bible, not as the prosecution. And Bryan, who, he never met a stage that he didn't love. And so this is his opportunity, because he said that he had come, this was so interesting, he said that he had come to Dayton not because of the Butler Act per se, but because he was fighting a duel to the death on behalf of Christianity. Because he really felt, I said what Darrow felt. Well, Bryan really felt that what was at stake was Christianity, and that schools are grooming atheists or agnostics, and that the country is falling apart unless he helps save it. And I firmly believe that he would have liked a constitutional amendment about this particular issue. But anyway, so he had said he's an expert on the Bible, and it's the Bible that we should be reading in this particular way. And so Darrow and the defense team were basically saying, you're an expert on the Bible? Okay, let me question you on the Bible. And so Bryan was more than happy to sit there in the hot July sun. These two guys, they got their sleeves all rolled, shirt sleeves rolled up, because it's so hot out. And they're outdoors. There's lemonade and, hot dogs and ice cream being sold around. And Darrow, I don't even know what the word is. Darrow interrogates Bryan.
Cross-examines him.
That's the word.
So here's my take on what's so fascinating. Not
Yeah.
anyone who's seen Inherit the Wind,
Boo.
seen Spencer Tracy
Oh, I love
conduct the cross-examination, but
Yeah.
Judge Ralston, piece of work, comes to court every day with his Bible. He's running for re-election in a year.
Can I interrupt 1 second?
Please.
He was happy. He had hoped, basically, Ralston, that the trial could be held in a football stadium. So that tells you something about his sense. And he was, talk about photographs. Every day he'd say, okay, now end of trial, time for photographs. And they would be, but go ahead. Yeah,
So Judge Ralston,
yeah, sorry.
there's the legal observation. Judge Ralston, before Brian takes the stand and is cross-examined by Darrow, denies the defense the ability to introduce into evidence all sorts of scientific evidence demonstrating what evolution is.
Exactly.
He excludes all of it as irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
But now he's going to let
Ah,
Darrow introduce biblical expert testimony.
yeah.
And Brian is egotistical enough to take the bait.
He said it. I didn't say it.
What happens next?
Well, just a word on the scientific testimony for a second, because I didn't think I would. You never know. I had such a great time reading the scientific testimony. It was illuminating to me, absolutely illuminating. And there were, I don't remember the exact number, there were at least, 10 scientists from all over the country, eminent people, several of whom taught Sunday school, who had come to Dayton in order to testify, because this was such an important issue for them, not just because the theory of evolution was pretty settled theory, but also because science education and even religion was at stake for these men. It was, again, all men, but it was just absolutely wonderful in that way. So, so we're back on the stand, and Brian is being cross-examined by Darrow on the Bible, basically. And I think the reason why that film, Inherit the Wind, which I didn't see until I was pretty much finished with the book, I have a lot not to say about that. But in any event, because some of the trial transcript, which is available, is so unbelievable, and I'm in theatrics. Darrow starts questioning Brian, not just about the Bible, but about history and about religion, and Brian says such things as, I don't think about Confucianism and Buddhism, and Darrow asks questions such as, that these are very ancient religions, and they actually predate Christianity. And Brian says they're inferior religions. The only thing I think about, or Darrow would ask Brian about dinosaurs, the flood, geology. And Brian would say, I'm not interested. I don't think about those things. And Darrow would say, do you think about the things you do think about? I mean, that was the kind of back and forth that you would get. But what was remarkable for Brian's adherents, for his followers, for the fundamentalists, was when Darrow began questioning him about specifics in the Bible, like, do you really believe that Joshua, made the sun stand still? And what do you think happened while the sun was standing still? Questions like that. But beyond that, when Darrow began to, when he asked about Eve and pregnancy, all kinds of things. But when Darrow went after creation happening in 6 days, and the seventh God rested, Brian says, well, it doesn't have to be 6 actual days. It could be, eras. Well, he he just undercut his whole point of view, right? Because he basically was saying he didn't read the Bible literally either. And that was it. That was pretty much it. By this time, by the way, the prosecution, the men on the prosecution team, who went on to somewhat illustrious careers, they were going crazy. I mean, they were so upset. They wanted this to stop because they realized what was happening. And Ralston was, well, he just wanted to hear Brian. He said, no. And Brian would say, no, I'm good to go. And Ralston would say, okay. And the prosecution, they were not stupid and they knew what was happening. But finally it stopped because, both men had lost their temper. And certainly Brian lost the argument. He kind of basically sort of undercut, as I said, himself. And pretty much that was the end of that, in that sense. It was kind of a chilling moment. If you were a Brian fan or a fundamentalist, it was chilling, really.
Epically famous cross-examination.
Yeah.
He led him down the Primrose Pass.
Yeah.
And then the trapdoor fell out from under him.
Right.
Right? The great literalist now admits that there are metaphors in the Bible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
None of that has anything to do with the test case, just my view of it.
Right.
This is
yeah.
Darrow trying to destroy Brianism.
And the argument. Yeah, Brianism. That's absolutely right. Because it wasn't just Brian, it was what Brian represented. And there was that term at the time. It was called Brianism. And you can see it. You can see that being discussed, in the first decades of the 20th century, not just 1925, but Brianism had been something that was an issue in the body politic, for sure. And Darrow, as I said, Darrow found it terrifying in a way because it was founded, to his mind, in prejudice and bigotry, simply put,
And just that there's and I'm a huge fan of Darrow, but there is a viciousness in the cross that ultimately may have taken its toll on Brian.
I don't believe that. No. I mean, the viciousness we could argue about, and you're probably
Well, he
right.
dies.
No, but because I feel, even writing it and reading about it and reading the transcript, I felt, oh my God, it must have been really painful to watch, seriously, because, these two men are going at it, and Brian, who really doesn't understand. I mean, he doesn't think about the things he doesn't think about, and that really sort of undid him in a way. And you're right, Darrow is relentless. I would say he's relentless with a cause. So it's not just viciousness for the sake of being viciousness. He wasn't that kind of person. He was a kind person. But Brian had become a symbol to him, and we sort of can understand that, I think. But Brian was a diabetic. Brian, there was enough known about diabetes at the time, and his father had died of it, that, you have to watch your intake of sugar. And he just didn't at all. And he was actually going to a doctor in Chattanooga, I think, right after that. So, and it was hot. But yeah, I don't think... what did Mencken say? The great and acerbic and nasty piece of work that is H.L. Mencken, who was at the trial. He said afterwards, God shot an arrow, and he aimed at Darrow, but he missed, and he got Brian. He said it. I didn't say it. So I mean, it would be easy to say that Darrow killed Brian, because that's what it looks like, but he didn't, of course. I mean,
Understood. So what happens at the trial? at the end?
Oh, but at the end, I mean, obviously Scopes is guilty. All this about, guess what? We already know that, he's guilty. He's guilty, and the trial and the case is going to go before the Tennessee Supreme Court, and then if it can get through the Supreme Court, it's going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and sort of that takes us to that moment, I think, and you're standing up. So you'll have to stay tuned for the next installment to see what happens.
We always leave time for audience questions, so we have at least 10 minutes. So if you have a question, raise your hand and jump right in.
I read your book and I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
But my question is, what led you to this topic?
The book before this that Hank had mentioned is it was about the first ever presidential impeachment, and at that particular time I got very interested in trials, in court trials, because to me they seem to kind of encapsulate a kind of drama, and if they're important trials, as the impeachment trial was, then really the drama isn't just about who done it, like Law and Order or something. It's really about larger issues. And it had been a very long time since I had written about the 1920s, the early part of the 20th century. And so it sort of became a perfect storm for me of issues coming together around a trial in which I was interested. I'd always been interested in the 20s, partly because, as I said earlier, it seemed so much of what we know about the 20s is hype. And so I was interested in sort of reinvestigating it. Also because it seemed to me, I wasn't entirely convinced that I knew what the trial was about. I mean, I know, we know what it's about, but I thought, what is it really about? So that's how I became interested. And then I started researching and seeing if there was something there. Thank you.
I'll ask one, since just raise your hand, I'll bring it around. But what parallels between Trumpism and Bryanism were you thinking about them when you were writing the book?
I wasn't thinking about any. No, I know that sounds disingenuous, but it's actually true. I mean, first, I don't have to think about them. They're there. No, in a certain sense, that was true, and it wasn't as pronounced. I mean, when you're working on a book, you kind of have blinders on. It's like, what do I have to do today? What do I have to read today? Does this sentence work? It's questions like that. Then when I would pull back, or I would give chapters to my husband to read, he would say, oh, the parallels, amazing, the parallels, and this and that. And of course they're there. The questions of education, the questions of censorship, the questions, about bigotry, the questions about fear of otherness, the questions of immigration. I mean, need I go on? But they weren't all extant, and they weren't all extant at the same level as they were. And also, truth be told, a lot of this book wasn't written, had nothing, Trump was gone. I mean, who knew? But you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, Impeachers came out in 2019. I started this around 2018, so some Trump left, but by 2020, we're worried about going outside and getting killed by viruses. So it wasn't uppermost in my mind. But anyway.
Yeah, was Inherit the Wind pretty accurate? From your description, it sounds very much the way I remember the play and the movie.
Well, the trial part, you're absolutely right, because as I said, it comes from the transcript. But everything else around it, I mean, they give John Scopes a girlfriend. And the girlfriend just happens to be the daughter of the mean fundamentalist preacher in town. So it's Romeo and Juliet. And then, as we were talking about, then the women in the town, they're right out of the Salem witchcraft, or more out of the Crucible, actually, with, the girls kind of sticking pins in John Scopes and Darrow. So everything around, I mean, the trial itself, I mean, just not even the trial, just that interrogation. And there's no Hayes, there's no Malone, there's, you know, it's basically a kind of gussied up love story. And then H.L. Mencken, whom I mentioned, he's played by Gene Kelly. I rest my case.
I was
Okay.
surprised.
Okay, you know, but you probably saw it in its own time. I saw it very recently. I'd never seen it. So, you know, maybe if I'd seen it, I'd be a lawyer today.
Yeah, when talking with my students, college seniors, about this event,
Yeah.
mentioned the trial of the century, I thought they would say, "Oh, OJ." They didn't even say OJ. They didn't know about the Scopes
Right,
monkey
I'm not
trial.
surprised, yeah.
I was surprised it doesn't seem to be in the curriculum of high school history books.
Yeah, I
What's-
mean, I guess I said I'm not surprised only because because that's happened to me so often, and it's happened not just in the demographic that you're talking about, your you know, high school students. It's happened in demographics of people, say, in their 40s, you know, that they haven't heard of it either. I don't remember. I must have learned about it in high school. I didn't see the movie. I didn't even know about the movie. It probably got a couple of paragraphs, but it wasn't front and center the way. I think it's disappeared to a large extent, you know, and it'd be interesting to me to know if other so-called trials of the century had disappeared. Did they know about Sacco and Vanzetti, for example? You say, did they know about the Rosenbergs? I mean, there are a lot of mean trials in that century. Did they know about the Scottsboro boys? Yeah.
Just a question here. This is a very relevant book to today, because I really believe that we're going to have the library moms who are taking out
Yeah,
books
I know.
from libraries. They're going to go after evolution again.
Yeah.
And the U.S. has cultural discussions are on repeat, and every 15 years
Yeah.
we have evolution come up. And 15 years ago, we still had somebody like Stephen Jay Gould,
Yeah.
who was very persuasive. But this is going to come up again.
Yeah.
And I think that we haven't learned too much from the past. We think there's a conflict between religion and science. Catholic Church says otherwise. But this is going to come up again.
Well, yeah, I think so. I think I think it was in 1980, but I might be wrong about this. It was maybe you probably know Louisiana trial or something that said you can't teach creationism at the same time as evolution, something like that. And Stephen Jay. Intelligent design. Yeah. So Stephen Jay Gould at that time, he was alive then, and people were celebrating, and Stephen Jay Gould said, don't celebrate, because this is going to come up again. And it's what I was saying before about strands, you know, in American culture. Things don't happen and then they're over. It is cyclical. These things happen. It's important to stay vigilant. It's not a question of it's not just a question of learning from the past, but it's also, you know, oh, if we learn from the past, then we won't repeat it. It's not that so much as how to stay vigilant, how to push back, and also the kind of reinforcement and hope that there are people who have pushed back and have been more or less successful. But Hank and I were talking before the event, and we're saying that, you know, in a certain sense, Darrow lost, and of course, you know, it didn't go to the Supreme Court, you know, spoiler alert. And, but you probably knew that. And, but in the court of public opinion, he absolutely won, because, you know, so the fundamentalists didn't go away, anti-evolutionists didn't go away, but people were educated. People did listen. It did tamp something down for a long time. It doesn't mean it's gone. We would be naive to think, oh, that's then, that, you know, oh, we fought the Civil War, you know, in that sense. So I think you're absolutely right. and I think it's important to know that you're right. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I assume when you write, you have an audience in mind. So
Yeah,
when
true.
so when you're covering a topic that's this well examined, when you're covering a topic that's this well examined,
Yeah.
are you thinking of an audience coming to it new, or are you thinking of an audience well familiar with it and you're trying to find a new angle or something different to say?
Well, it's a hard thing to quite answer. I mean, basically, Gertrude Stein has a great quote that I always like, and it says, "I write for myself and strangers." And I like it because, first of all, I'm writing for myself. And as I said earlier, I have a question that I need to have answered. And it was like, why don't I know about this impeachment? Or, what happened? Why did Gertrude Stein never talk to her brother again? Or, in this case, what happened with the Scopes trial? Because I can't quite get my head around the fact that a fissure in the Protestant church, which it was, I didn't even talk about that, created this kind of controversy because the liberals versus, liberal/modernists versus fundamentalists. So I'm writing for myself, but I'm also writing for strangers. And when I'm not being glib when I say I'm writing for you, I'm thinking of a large audience always, but my feeling is the only way you get that is by writing well. So when I'm saying I'm laboring over a sentence, I'm not kidding, in that sense.
So this has been a wonderful hour. I wish it was like Netflix and we could say go to episode 2 and go 4 more hours, but we've had a wonderful hour.
Thank you.
Hank and I were saying the same thing. We read a lot of history. I read a lot of nonfiction. The craft that you bring to it is very rare, not just the research and the scholarship, but you can hear from this conversation, so readable, so accessible, funny, weird, interesting.
Like me.
It's a tremendous book, and on World Book Day, let's support our independent bookstore. Let's hear a big round for Hank Greenberg and Brenda Wineapple. Thank you.